This is Neil Ratner Rock Doc here on WDST Radio Woodstock with another episode of This Week in Rock, stories from the soundtrack of our lives. In September of 1975, David Bowie had his first #1 song in the U.S. with the song Fame, a song written with the help of John Lennon. So today, I thought I would tell you a few things about the relationship between David Bowie and John Lennon that you might not know. And as usual, a little background first. John Lennon was an idol of Bowie's, and although David was already a superstar when the two first met, Bowie was still starstruck. David asked his producer, Tony Visconti, to accompany him to the meeting, which occurred at a hotel in New York City. And according to Visconti, Bowie appeared terrified of the former Beatle. David got out his sketch pad and started doing charcoal drawings while the pair sat in silence, until John finally asked Bowie for a few sheets of his sketch pad, explaining, "I want to draw you." Bowie replied, "That's a good idea." So the silence was finally broken, and the duo began drawing caricatures of each other. Visconti said this rather surreal moment finally got the two stars chatting and laughing, forming the basis of a great friendship. At the time, David was having trouble with his manager, so he asked John how he should go about getting a new one.
I said, I hate this manager that I've got. What can I do about it? How do I get a new manager? And that's just stop right there. No management. You don't need management. I mean, he was the first artist I'd ever met who told me that I didn't need management, that it was not necessary, and bless him, forever after that, I did get rid of that manager, and I virtually managed myself my entire life. I've had business advisors and all that, but the idea of management has never crossed my path again since 77-ish.
But was that an exciting thing for you, to work with John Lennon?
75, rather. Hell, I mean, he was one of the major influences on my musical life. I mean, I just thought he was the very best of what could be done with rock and roll, and also ideas, how he was so, I mean, I felt such kin to him in as much as that he would rifle the avant-garde and look for ideas that were so on the outside, on the periphery of what was the mainstream, and then apply them in a functional manner to something that was considered populist, and make it work. He would take the most odd idea and make it work for the masses. And I thought that was just so admirable. I mean, that was like making art work for the people and not sort of having it as an elitist, thing. There was just so much about him that I admired. He was tremendous,
During January of 1975, Bowie was in New York City finishing his album Young Americans. He had decided to do a cover of the Beatles song Across the Universe. And since John was also in New York City working on his album Rock and Roll, Bowie invited Lennon to come down to the studio. But as John explains, working in the studio with other artists was not something he was very comfortable with.
I was never in the London scene in the 60s, whereas George and Paul would be going around everybody's sessions all the time, playing with everybody. I never played anywhere without the Beatles. I never jammed around with people at all.
Loyalty, or it just didn't interest you?
No, just shyness, insecurity, and I couldn't go in a session and play like George plays. I'm limited vocabulary on the guitar and the piano. So what could I do going in with Cream or whatever they were doing those days? So I never hung out in the clubs playing. I hung out in the discos boogieing and drinking and that, but I never did that bit. And then suddenly I was working with Elton, and then Bowie was around and we were talking and that, and he'd say, "Come down," and I found myself doing that. So he's fiddling around, he writes them in the studio. Now he goes in about 4 words and a few guys and starts laying down this stuff. And he has virtually nothing, he's making it up in the studio. So I just contributed whatever I contributed, like backwards piano and a couple of things like repeat of Fame. And then we needed a middle 8, so we took some Stevie Wonder middle 8 and did it backwards, and we made a record out of it, right? So he got his first #1, so I felt that was like the karmic thing, With me and Elton, I got my first #1, so I passed it on to Bowie and he got his, and I like that track, I must say I admire him, vast repertoire of talent the guy has.
The idea of making a song about being famous came out of a conversation Bowie had with Lennon, who felt that fame was useless since it took a huge part of your life away. David went even further, saying that fame itself, of course, doesn't really afford you anything more than a good seat in a restaurant. That must be pretty well known by now. I'm just amazed how fame is being posited as the be-all and end-all. However arrogant and ambitious I think we were in my generation, I think the idea was that if you do something really good, you'll become famous. The emphasis on fame itself is something new. Now, it's to be famous, you should do what it takes, which is not the same thing at all. And it will leave many of them with this empty feeling. I'll end with a funny story. Bowie and Lennon were in a strip club together in Hong Kong. John was sloppy drunk and was asked to leave. Once in the street, Lennon started shouting and cursing at the owner, who told Lennon to screw off. A frustrated John yells back, "Do you know who I am? I'm a friggin' Beatle." Bowie looks at him, and the two start to laugh hysterically. As they walked away, there was a street market selling Beatles jackets. David bought one, made John put it on, and took a Polaroid, which probably still exists somewhere. Okay, let's listen. David Bowie, with a little help from John Lennon, and fame.